Isaiah chapter 14. Before we begin reading in verse 16 this morning, I wanted to briefly go over something we had discussed last week in verses 11 through 15, which is where we see Lucifer. It says in verse 12, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? It says in verse 13, For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will also sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. We spoke about this last week, and that is that a lot of people will use this as the scriptural evidence for the casting out of Satan from heaven. And while it is a casting out of Satan from heaven, it's not the original casting out of Satan from heaven. As you can see here, it says, How art thou, in verse 12, how art thou cut to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? Satan hadn't done any weakening of nations yet, before he was cast out. There were no nations to have been weakened. Satan was present in the Garden of Eden. No nations had yet existed on the earth at the time of the creation of Adam and Eve. Now, you can get into, was Satan cast out before the creation of the Garden of Eden? Was Satan cast out after the creation of the Garden of Eden and the creation of Adam and Eve? And was, because you see some people will get into the idea that they go back into Genesis chapter 1, and where it says that God saw his creation and that it was good. And they'll say, well, because it was good, Satan hadn't been cast out yet, so Satan had to have been cast out after that. Now, I don't necessarily follow that line of thinking, but if you do, that's fine. You can believe what you want. I don't think that had anything to do with Satan's existence as an evil being instead of his original form, which is described, and we read this last week briefly. We'll touch on it again. Ezekiel chapter 28. It says in verse 13, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. And the workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. And so Satan was created a perfect being. He was created a perfect being who became imperfect. In the same way that Adam and Eve were created as perfect beings in the image of God and then became imperfect through sin. Now that was at the instigation of Satan, but it's not at the blame of Satan. They did it of their own free will. So, but just so we understand, this is Satan in his original form. As it's described here, he was a magnificent being, something to truly behold, something that God believed that was something to truly behold. He takes so much time to explain this here in Ezekiel. I believe he truly did value whatever name Satan had, whether that be Lucifer. Some people say Lucifer was his name before the fall. It was his angel name. I don't believe that, because as we see here, Lucifer is what's used to describe him, way later. We believe this is something in Isaiah chapter 14 that is yet to occur. This casting out is yet to occur. So I don't know what his name was originally. It could be Lucifer, because that just means shining one. It's possible, but I don't want to speculate too much on that. We know from Luke chapter 10 verse 18, Jesus says whenever he has sent out these 70 people, these 70 disciples, and they've gone out and they've done great things and they've cast out demons in his name. He says in verse 18, And he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Jesus was there. He was present. He saw the casting out of Satan. He saw what happened when Satan was removed permanently from his position of authority. Now we know from the book of Job, I'm not going to go back and read it, but Job chapter 1, Satan still, even after he was cast out, he still had the ability to travel back and forth, whatever distance that is, whatever laws of physics that God suspends in order to get something from this plane of existence to that plane of existence. Satan still had the ability to to use that. I don't know what it was. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to get too detailed with it because it's beyond me. But he had that ability. And he had to give an account to God. If God said he had to give an account, he had to be there instantaneously. And so he was there at that time. It says with the other sons of God. That's how you know that the sons of God in the book of Genesis were actually angels, because people don't go to heaven to give an account to God and then come back. We do have to give a final account as Christians at the judgment seat of Christ. People will have to give a final account at the great white throne judgment. But there's no coming back from that. There's no, just coming in to report, sir. No. Have a great day. I'll be back next week. That's not how it works. Just wanted to really hammer that in because most of the stuff you see on the internet, most of the stuff you see, with on television, most of the stuff that you see in books, they claim that this is the casting out of Satan. And I wish I didn't, want to, spend so much time on this, but it's a real state of confusion for a lot of people, and I just want to really make sure that that's hammered home for everybody. And if you just read the surrounding verses there, you can see why. Because there were no nations, there were no people to manipulate, there were no anything for him to be accused of these things, and rightfully so. He hadn't yet done those things. So he will in the future, and the Antichrist will in the future. But that's not something that we need to worry about. It's just something that I want you to understand. So we'll start reading here now in verse 16. It says, "They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, even all of them, lie in glory. Every one is in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. Prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise, nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name, and remnant, and son, and nephew, saith the Lord. I will also make it a possession for the bittern, and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, Surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my hand, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. Rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken, for out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. And the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety, and I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou, whole Palestina, art dissolved, for there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. What shall one then answer the messengers of the nations, that the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it? So, going back to verse 16, we see here that we're still dealing with Babylon. It says, They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms? And so, in the same way we won't go read it again, but in Ezekiel chapter 28, in the same way that Satan was being addressed there through the king of Tyre, or Tyrus, Satan was addressed here for a brief period through Babylon. It's the same exact format. God is doing the same exact thing through his prophets in this way. And now in verse 16, it's a shift back to the king of Babylon. Now again, what we're talking about when we're talking about Babylon. There's ancient Babylon, which a lot of these prophecies have, any prophecy relating to ancient Babylon has already been fulfilled because ancient Babylon no longer exists. It's gone. So the other side of that is Mystery Babylon, the Babylon that exists in the book of Revelation, in the neighborhood of chapter 17 through 19. That's where you see Mystery Babylon, and some of the stuff in here that we're reading about in Isaiah is a reference to that future kingdom of Mystery Babylon. Again, in chapters 13 through 23, a lot of the prophecies have been fulfilled. Some have yet to be fulfilled. We know that from our study through the book, when we did the study for Obadiah, and we talked about the kingdom of Edom, the nation of Edom. There are many, many things that have already come to pass on them. We don't know. You can't point at somebody and say, well, they're an Edomite. They're from Esau. You can't do that because you don't know. God knows. And they will have a final judgment eventually. But we with our limited information and with our, fallible human minds, we cannot determine, well, this is the people group specifically that God is talking about, and these aren't, even though they look exactly alike. And they live in the same place and speak the same language and believe the same things and eat the same food and have the same culture. We don't know those things. God knows. So, moving forward, he says in verse 18, all the kings of the nations, even all of them lie in glory, every one in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. And so remember, we'll just briefly discuss the ancient history here. Babylon, you could say, was, some people might argue this, but Babylon, in scriptural terms, is the first great world power. No other nation before it had ever achieved what it had. Assyria had come kind of close. Assyria had begun establishing an empire, if you remember. They were a very warlike people, very brutal, very destructive, with a conquering mindset. But they, in fact, let me put it to you this way, just a few hundred years after their destruction, they built all their buildings out of clay. Okay? Just a few hundred years after their destruction, Alexander the Great marched through that area of the land, and he walked by Nineveh, which was a great, fantastic, gigantic city, arrayed with walls and gates, and walls around that to prevent flooding. And he walked by it, and it was no more than just a mound on the ground, and he asked, well, what's that? What is this? He had no clue that there was this great civilization that had existed there. God completely wiped them out. And he did that using Babylon. Babylon, everybody still, it's ruins, but you know where it's at. It's in Iraq. And so it's just, you can still identify where this place was. And using ancient archaeology, you can identify Nineveh if you really wanted to. You can identify its site, but you can't look at buildings, you can't look at anything. There's nothing remaining. So, Babylon, though, again, as the first great world power, you look at verse 17, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners. And then back in verse 16, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms? That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He made the earth to tremble and he shook kingdoms. You did not want to mess with Nebuchadnezzar. You did not want to mess with Babylon at that time. And so everybody in that land, everybody in the Middle East held a grudge against Babylon in some form, some shape, some way, including Egypt, which was all the way down on the African continent. There was nobody who had a really nice, friendly relationship with Babylon. So it says again, we'll look here in verse 19, but thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Babylon was eventually taken over by Persia. Persia was eventually put down by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great. And then the Greeks, they were eventually overthrown by the Romans. And who overthrew the Romans? It never happened. It just didn't. And according to Scripture, they're to be overthrown. You can go and you can look at, and Ron mentioned it here just recently, Daniel chapter 2. The idol that Daniel saw. Gold, silver, brass, iron, and then iron and clay mixed together. The gold would have been Babylon. The silver would have been the Persian kingdom. The brass would have been Alexander the Great's Macedonian armies, Greece. The iron would be Rome, and then you see that last and final piece, the iron and clay mixed together. You see, that's still Rome. It's just revived and it's in a different form, but it's still the same. The one who will overthrow that is Jesus. But what does that have to do with what we're talking about here with Babylon? Well, that kingdom, that place, it's referred to as Mystery Babylon in the book of Revelation. Why in the world would it be that? Well, the top of the idol is Babylon, the bottom of the idol is Rome. It's the same satanic force. It's the same satanic idea. It's the same satanic presence all the way down throughout that idol in each and every one of those kingdoms. God allowed it to happen, and God used each successive piece on that idol to judge the previous one. But there was no judgment for Rome. It divided itself. It was it kind of just fizzled out. There were barbarians attacking it and so on. But those were people from within the Roman Empire itself. They'd conquered those lands, and then they kind of lost them, and then it just kind of fizzled out. Rome just kind of, it just went into a state of dormancy. Just like when the trees, not if they're coniferous, but if they're deciduous, they go into a state of dormancy in the wintertime. And they look dead, but they're not. A volcano can be dormant for a really long time. But all it takes is God to just make a little change somewhere, and it explodes once again. And it can go from dormant to active. In the same way, Rome can go from dormant to active whenever God says it's about time. And so that's why I'm talking about that in relation to Babylon here, because it's the same. Satan is the same throughout it. Whenever we like to go to Hebrews and we like to say Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. Same thing's true about Satan. He's the same yesterday, he's the same today, and he's going to be the same up until he gets thrown into the lake of fire. You can rely on that. That's the one thing you can rely on Satan for. He will always be evil. He will always be purposed against God. There's not going to be any sequel. There's not going to be any crossover episode where they get the villain to assist the good guy. That's not what's going to happen. Satan isn't that. Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity, never to be released, never to see anything else than eternal suffering. And thank the Lord that we don't have to try to put him there, because he's too much for us. You know how I know he's too much for us? Before you come back to church this evening, you will have committed at least one sin. I guarantee it. You will say something wrong. You will think something wrong. You will do something wrong. You'll put your mind on something it doesn't need to be on. At least once. I guarantee it. And I'm not saying that Satan himself is responsible for that, but he's going to instigate it, and you're going to go along with it. And that's what's going to happen. We don't have that power. Only Jesus has that power. We don't have the ability to set everything right in this world. Only Jesus has that power. We don't have the ability to save ourselves from hell. Only Jesus has that power. So, we look here and we see that Babylon will be destroyed. God will destroy this place, this ancient Babylon, which has been destroyed, and mystery Babylon in the future. It says in verse 20, "Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned." Now, from ancient history, from what I know, I don't believe that Nebuchadnezzar ever went on a crusade in his own kingdom. And I don't believe Belshazzar had any kind of competence to be able to pull off such a thing. I don't think this is something that's happened yet. I think this is something that's describing a future event. Because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people, the seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. Now, you might say, well, Nebuchadnezzar, if he got to a point in his life where if people didn't worship him, then he was willing to go ahead and put them to death. I don't think that's what this is talking about. That's kind of par for the course for a lot of kings throughout history, a lot of leaders throughout history. That's not anything specifically unique to him. Belshazzar, he spent too much time with women and wine to do much of anything. So once again, this is something that is going to happen in the future. I know who does destroy a lot of the people in his own kingdom, who's related to Babylon. That's the Antichrist in Mystery Babylon. That's absolutely what we see in the book of Revelation. It's absolutely what we see throughout prophecy in the Old Testament. In the book of Daniel, chapter 11, we see it. We see things prophesied in the book of Zechariah. The Antichrist is going to get people to go to war. Well, they're fighting a pointless war. He's just putting them to the death. You can't fight against God. So, he says in verse 21, "Prepare slaughter for his children, for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise, nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name, and remnant, and son, and nephew, saith the Lord of hosts." God said he's going to get rid of Babylon. He's going to cut them off. He said, the name, and remnant, and son, and nephew. Now that doesn't mean he's going to find a person and he's going to say, okay, where's your nephew at? Where is your brother's child? Nephew here just kind of means male descendant. So when he says name, remnant, son, and nephew, he's extending that to everybody. The way the word nephew is used in the Bible isn't necessarily the same way we use that word today. It doesn't have a specific meaning for sibling's child. It's, male relative, male descendant, just kind of a generic term there. So God is using this generic term here to say he'll get rid of everybody. He says, "I will also make it a possession for the bittern and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts." If you look at the ruins of ancient Babylon, that's what happened to it. And we discussed it. I think we discussed it last week. It was considered haunted for centuries. Or maybe we discussed it 2 weeks ago. It was considered a haunted place. People thought it was truly haunted. Up until Saddam Hussein decided he wanted to try to build a village in that area and try to, make something out of it, because it is set in a really beautiful place. When you think of Iraq, what do you think of? You think of desert, you think of
wasteland.
Yeah, wasteland, that's what you think of. You think the first great world power would be set in a wasteland with no resources? No. Babylon, that city, it was set in a very luscious location. Not a very widespread luscious location, because once you get very far away from the river, it turns to desert pretty quick. But it was set in a really good spot. And so Saddam Hussein, he wanted to use that place. He wanted to get people back in there and try to use what little resources that exist in that country at this point. And still today, there's very few resources in that country unless you want to talk about stuff like oil. So we'll get off of that and we'll move on here. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, this is verse 24, and we're kind of switching topics here. Surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains, and tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. So we've dealt a lot with the burden on Babylon. Here we're dealing with something regarding Assyria. It says in verse 26, and I want you to pay close attention to what God says here. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed it, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. There wasn't a whole lot to say here about Assyria. But what was said, it says, this is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth. You know. And so I think it says here, you know, God has set this to be what is going to happen. And not only is it what is going to happen and nobody can turn it back, which is what we get from, you know, verse 27, but this is something that has ramifications. This is something that has a purpose in history. You know, I believe when God judges a nation, most of the time, it's part of his greater plan to bring things forward to a culmination at the end of what we would call history. You know, there are some times when a nation just gets really out of line and God just says, well, you know, they're not really important to the grand scheme of things as a nation. They don't really have that much influence, but God just has to, you know, get rid of them. We probably don't read about too many of those because I'd say a lot of that happened and it just didn't need to be recorded. But a lot of the stuff that we see where nations are judged here in the Bible, it wasn't necessarily just for their judgment. It was about bringing forward God's plan and setting things up and getting things ready for the future. You know, for example, I believe there was a specific reason that Jesus came back during the time of the Romans instead of during the time of Alexander the Great, instead of during the time of, or did I say came back, was born during the time of, that Jesus was born during the time of the Roman Empire as opposed to the other great world empires that we've seen. Specifically, judgment had to take place for Israel. And so God said that there would be judgment for Israel and it would need to take place and it had to have its time. Well, they'd had some judgment. They'd had about 400 years with no direct revelation from God whatsoever. No scripture writing had occurred during that time. Another thing is the Roman Empire. What are they known for? You know, what's one thing that they're known for? Now, that might be kind of a vague question. Logistically, what are they known for? What's that saying? All what lead to Rome? Roads.
Roads, they built the roads and marked
All
them.
roads lead to.
All roads lead to Rome. What made it really easy for Jesus to get back and forth from one place to another when he was in his ministry? Because he wasn't accepted in his own land.
He had a good road to travel.
Yeah, I mean they were safe, which I don't think that's necessarily something that God was too worried about. When Jesus got in trouble, we know he turned invisible. God allowed him to turn invisible and just get out of there. And you know, if he wasn't invisible, at the very least, you know, something happened to obscure his presence from all the people around him. They had all this great technology, all these feats of engineering, all these things that made it easy to transport yourself from one place to another. If you needed it, you know, you could get certain supplies, certain materials. They weren't exactly rich, so I don't think that was exactly a huge concern of Jesus and his 12, especially since they had the one in charge of the money skimming off the top of it. But you know, it was a place that was ripe. It was ripe for Jesus to come at that specific time. And so you see that the judgment of Babylon, allowed for Persia to rise. The judgment of Persia allowed for the Macedonians to rise. And without that, I don't believe we would have gotten Rome. I don't believe that those things would have happened unless the things in the past had happened. It would have happened differently. And God worked it out so that it happened the way it did, so that it worked out that Jesus could come at the time that he did. And so that's just one example of how God works things out through history to meet his ends. But that's what's being said here. This judgment of the Assyrian, he says that I will break the Assyrian in my land. And upon my mountains tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. God says, I'm going to, and I believe this is something that, this specifically is something that has happened. This specifically is prophecy that has been fulfilled. The Assyrians were cut off. It made it easier, at least in the short term, on the people of Israel and on the people of Judah. And it says in verse 28, in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. So now it says in verse 29, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken, for out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. When it says Palestina here, or Palestina, however you want to pronounce that, your first instinct is to think of, Palestine. Just that, the reference to what, we might call it Palestine, just the whole landmass over there that was once at one time called Israel. Just that whole, people call it the Levant, the Holy Land, whatever term you use for it. It's tempting to think that that's what this word is referring to. Palestine in and of itself wasn't a term that was used up until the Romans. Romans didn't exist at the time that Isaiah wrote this. So what might this be a reference to? Well, if you think about the origins of the term Palestine, the Romans named that land Palestine because of the Philistines. Okay? And why would they do that? Well, after the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people from that land around AD 70, the Romans thought, these people might want to come back at some point. And so one of their strategies was to name the area Palestine after the Philistines to discourage the Jewish people from ever coming back. Because, it would be named after a people that had historically been their enemy. This word Palestina is a reference to not Palestine as a whole, as we know it, but to the Philistines. And if you want to know specifically the landmass that's referenced in relation to the Philistines, it's fairly well mapped today, the Gaza Strip. That's the ancient home of the Philistines in history. So think that's the place we're talking about when we're reading these few verses. It says, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. And the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety, and I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved, for there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. What shall one then answer the messengers of the nation? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. And here is like the death warrant signed for the Philistines here. Whenever Israel and Judah were being attacked and assailed by Assyria, do you think they just stopped at Judah and Benjamin? No. They kept going further down. They couldn't take Judah. They couldn't take Jerusalem. God didn't allow that. But they kept going. And they made it difficult for these Philistine people just a little bit further south and to the west. And when Nebuchadnezzar's armies came through and took this part of the world, You really think they just stopped at Jerusalem? No. No, they had dealings all the way down in Egypt. For sure, they took this part of the land too. And so, like I said, here we see the death warrant for the Philistines, and it says, "What shall one then answer the messengers of the nation?" It says, "That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it." God is going to has allowed the Philistines to be destroyed. I don't believe the Philistines ever show up anywhere in future prophecy about nations that are to come and serve, in the millennial kingdom. There's a reference to Canaanites, which are not Philistines. There are times whenever the Edomites are referenced. Those are not Philistines. This is basically the end for them. And he says, well, my people are going to continue. The Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. You're both going to go through some stuff, but, God's people will make it through, and you will not. That was their message. That was their burden. And that might seem kind of harsh, but they were not God-fearing people. They did not serve God. They served against God. They did not worship God. They worshiped against God. Their purpose was to be against God. Now, if you ask them, is your purpose to be against God? That might not be the generic response you would get. Yes, my purpose is to be against God. But if you ask them, what do you think about those Jewish people just a little bit to the north? What do you think about those people? You'd get negative responses every time. They were purposed against God's people, therefore they were purposed against God. And that's the same thing. It's the same thing with these people that call themselves Palestinians. They are purposed against God's people. They are purposed against God. Now, I'm not saying that, because you'll see sometimes, because the news has to show the heartthrob stories, you'll see sometimes that there's this poor old woman that they're worried about her getting evicted out of her home, and the Israeli government is doing this and the Israeli government is doing that. I'm not going to stand here with a straight face and tell you that I think the Israeli government is perfect. How could I? It's made up of human beings. The same way that our government is made up of human beings. The same way that our church is made up of human beings. We know people are imperfect. We know people do things that are wrong. I am 100% certain the Israeli government has done things wrong, at different times. I am also 100% certain that those Palestinian people, that's not a real people group, but, for the sake of identifying them, we'll use that term, because that's how they're referring to themselves nowadays. These basic, just Arab people inhabiting Jordan and inhabiting Syria and inhabiting the West Bank, as it's called, they are purposed against God because they are purposed against his people. I'm not saying that they've been treated exactly righteously in every step of the way. I don't believe they have. No human being has ever treated another human being exactly righteously in every step of the way, except for Jesus. So, I'm not making an argument for their cause, because I still support, I'm going to support Israel. I'm not going to say that they're right when they're wrong, but they're the ones who've got my support. God said all the way back to Abraham, he would bless those that bless his people, and he'd curse those that curse his people. And I don't want to be on that curse side. But what we see here is, again, throughout chapters 13 through 23, we're seeing that curse those that curse my people. That's what this is about. You're seeing judgment. You're seeing judgment of neighboring nations who have purposed themselves against God's people. So, Lord willing, next week we'll be in chapter 15. We're going to discuss Moab. We're going to be discussing Moab for quite a while. God has quite a lot to say about them. So you might as well get prepared for that. Any quick comments or questions this morning?